Before we begin tonight's journey into the ancient world, I want to ask you to please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like if you find it helpful for your sleep and relaxation. Your support means everything to me and helps me create more content like this for you. I would also love to hear from you in the comments below, please. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. It is so wonderful to know that we are all connected across the world through these peaceful moments before sleep, creating a global community of rest and tranquility. Now, let yourself sink deeply into your bed, feeling the soft embrace of your pillows and blankets as they cradle your body like gentle clouds. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen naturally, as if you are breathing in the cool evening air of an ancient Mediterranean garden where olive trees whisper secrets in the gentle breeze and lavender fills the air with its calming scent. Feel the weight of the day melting away from your shoulders, your arms, your entire body, as you prepare to drift into a world long past, where stories of courage and struggle unfold like pages in an ancient scroll. Our story today begins in the dusty, sun-baked city of Rome in the year 73 AD, when the great Colosseum was still under construction and the empire stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the golden sands of Egypt. In this time of marble temples and cobblestone streets, of emperors and senators, there lived a different kind of person, men and women, whose lives were bound by chains both literal and invisible, whose days were measured not in freedoms but in survival. These were the gladiators, and their story is one that speaks to the depths of human endurance and the price of entertainment in a world where life was often brutal and short. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of Rome on a warm morning, the sun casting long shadows between the towering insulae, the apartment buildings where most Romans lived. The air is thick with the scent of bread baking in stone ovens, the sound of merchants calling their wares, and the constant rumble of wooden cartwheels against stone. But as you move away from the bustling Forum Romanum, away from the gleaming temples and public baths, you find yourself in a different part of the city entirely. Here, the streets grow quieter, the buildings more fortress-like, and the very air seems to carry a weight of resignation and fear. This is where the gladiator schools stood, massive compounds called ludus that housed hundreds of fighters in conditions that would make even the poorest Roman citizen grateful for their freedom. These schools, known as ludus gladiatorius, were where gladiators lived and trained, but they were more prison than school, more warehouse than home. Picture thick stone walls rising high above the street, topped with iron spikes and watched constantly by armed guards. The only windows were small slits near the top, barely wide enough for a bird to pass through, and the heavy wooden gates were reinforced with iron bands that gleamed dully in the morning sun. Inside these walls, life began before dawn with the harsh sound of a wooden staff striking iron bars, echoing through the narrow corridors like thunder in a canyon. The gladiators would wake not in comfortable beds, but on thin straw mattresses laid on cold stone floors, their bodies already aching from the previous day's training and the cramped conditions of their cells. Most were chained at night, the cold iron around their ankles a constant reminder that they were property, not people, human beings whose lives had been reduced to their entertainment value in the arena. The morning meal was a cruel joke of Roman civilization, consisting primarily of barley porridge that was little better than animal feed. This diet of barley was known to bulk gladiators up, giving them the muscular appearance that crowds loved to see. But it was hardly the feast of champions that popular imagination might suggest. The gladiators would eat in silence, knowing that speaking without permission could earn them a beating, their eyes cast down toward their wooden bowls, as they consumed the gray, tasteless gruel that would fuel their bodies for another day of grueling preparation for what might be their final performance. After this meager breakfast, the real horror of gladiator life began, the training that would either forge them into killing machines or break them entirely. The training grounds were sandy courtyards surrounded by high walls, where wooden posts stood like ancient sentinels, their surfaces scarred and splintered from countless sword strikes. Here, under the watchful eye of trainers called doctors, the gladiators would spend hours perfecting the art of combat, learning not just to fight but to die with dignity when their time came. The training was relentless and punishing, designed to strip away every trace of the person they once were and replace it with something harder, colder, more suitable for the arena. They would practice their footwork until their legs trembled with exhaustion, their sword strikes until their arms burned with lactic acid, their defensive maneuvers until muscle memory took over from conscious thought. Blood was a constant companion in these sessions, flowing from cuts and scrapes that were considered minor injuries, badges of honor in a world where pain was currency and endurance was survival. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of gladiator training was the constant awareness that they were being prepared not just to fight, but to kill people who were very much like themselves. These were not evil men and women. They were slaves captured in distant wars, debtors who had lost everything, criminals whose crimes were often as simple as stealing bread to feed their families. Many gladiators were prisoner soldiers who had been captured and enslaved, men who had once fought for their own countries and people, now forced to fight for the amusement of their conquerors. As the weeks and months passed, the gladiators learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the ludus, where survival often depended on understanding unspoken rules and forming alliances with other fighters. The veteran gladiators, those who had survived multiple fights in the arena, held a special status, their scars and gray hair marking them as living legends in a world where most did not live to see 30. These men and women became mentors and teachers, passing down not just combat techniques, but the even more valuable lessons of how to read a crowd, how to maximize their chances of receiving mercy, and how to make their deaths meaningful if mercy was not forthcoming. The life of a gladiator was wrought with hardships, with low life expectancy, dreadful living conditions, and constant injuries. Yet there was a strange dignity in their suffering that even their Roman masters could not entirely strip away. In the evenings, after the day's training was done and the guards had locked them in their cells, the gladiators would sometimes share stories of their former lives, memories of families they would never see again, of lands they would never return to, of dreams that had died when they were first chained and marched to Rome. These conversations happened in whispered tones, because even their words were not their own. They spoke of children who would grow up not knowing their fathers, of wives who had been sold into slavery alongside them or left to struggle alone in distant provinces. They remembered harvest festivals and wedding celebrations, the taste of wine made from grapes grown in their own soil, the feeling of warm sun on their backs as they worked in fields that belonged to them and their ancestors. These memories were precious beyond gold, small flames of humanity that flickered in the darkness of their captivity. The gladiators also developed their own culture, their own codes of honor that existed parallel to, and often in defiance of Roman law. They would share their meager possessions, a crust of bread saved from dinner, a small piece of cloth that could serve as a bandage, a kind word when someone was struggling with despair. They learned to celebrate small victories together, like when one of their number survived a particularly brutal training session, or when word came that a former companion had won his freedom through exceptional performance in the arena. As you listen to this story, feel your own body relaxing deeper into comfort, your breathing becoming slower and more rhythmic, like the ancient Mediterranean waves that lap against the shores of Italy. Let your mind drift with these images of long-ago struggles, knowing that you are safe and warm in your own bed, surrounded by the peace and security that these ancient fighters could only dream of. The weight of their story settles over you like a gentle blanket, not heavy with sadness, but soft with the understanding that human resilience can endure even the darkest circumstances. The gladiators' days were structured around the brutal reality of their situation, but within that structure, they found moments of unexpected beauty and connection. Sometimes, in the brief periods between training sessions, they would sit in whatever shade they could find and teach each other skills from their former lives. A former farmer might show others how to weave grass into rope. A former metal worker might share techniques for sharpening weapons. A former storyteller might recount epic tales from his homeland that helped transport his listeners, however briefly, away from their current reality. These moments of teaching and learning were acts of quiet rebellion against a system that sought to reduce them to nothing more than instruments of violence. By sharing knowledge and culture, by maintaining connections to their past selves and their diverse backgrounds, the gladiators preserved essential parts of their humanity that no amount of training or brutality could completely erase. They were Romans now in terms of their legal status, but in their hearts they carried the seeds of dozens of different cultures, languages, and traditions that had shaped the Mediterranean world. The physical training regimen of a gladiator was designed to transform ordinary human beings into spectacular warriors. But the process was neither glamorous nor heroic in the way that modern entertainment might suggest. Each morning, after their meager breakfast of barley porridge, the gladiators would be led into the training courtyard where wooden swords called gladi and heavy shields awaited them. The weight of these practice weapons was deliberately increased beyond what they would use in actual combat, so that when they finally held real weapons in the arena, they would feel light and swift in their hands. Hour after hour they would practice the same movements: thrust, parry, advance, retreat, until their muscles screamed in protest and their hands bled from gripping the wooden handles. The doctors or trainers were often former gladiators themselves who had earned their freedom through exceptional skill and longevity in the arena. These men understood better than anyone the fine line between life and death that their students walked every day, and they pushed them with a brutality born of necessity rather than cruelty. A gladiator who was not perfectly prepared would die, and his death would reflect poorly on the school, potentially costing the lanista, the owner of the gladiator school, valuable contracts and reputation. The trainers would circle the practice area like wolves, their voices hoarse from shouting corrections and encouragement, their own scars serving as silent testimony to the lessons they had learned through pain and blood. Different types of gladiators required different training regimens. each designed to maximize the entertainment value of their eventual combat. The retieri, or net fighters, spent hours learning to manipulate their weighted nets and three-pronged tridents with the fluid grace of fishermen, while the heavily armored mirmillones practiced moving efficiently despite carrying shields and wearing helmets that severely limited their vision. The thresses, with their distinctive curved swords and small shields, developed lightning-fast reflexes and the ability to strike from unexpected angles, while the hoplomachus gladiators learned to fight with spears and daggers in combination, requiring them to master multiple weapons simultaneously. The training extended far beyond mere weapon work, encompassing every aspect of performance that would be expected in the arena. Gladiators learned to read crowds, to understand when spectators wanted to see mercy and when they hungered for blood. They practiced falling dramatically when wounded, making their injuries appear more severe than they actually were to increase the chances that the crowd would call for their lives to be spared. They studied the subtle art of making a fight appear closer and more exciting than it actually was, because a boring fight could result in punishment for both combatants regardless of who won. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more challenging than the physical training. The gladiators had to learn to compartmentalize their emotions, to separate their humanity from their function as entertainers. They practiced looking fierce and intimidating while walking into the arena, even when their hearts were pounding with terror. They learned to salute the emperor or the sponsor of the games with apparent pride and enthusiasm, even though they were about to risk their lives for the amusement of people who saw them as little more than exotic animals. Most difficult of all, they had to prepare themselves mentally for the possibility that they might have to kill someone they had trained alongside, eaten with, and considered a friend. The gladiators developed elaborate rituals and superstitions to help them cope with the constant proximity of death. Some would pray to their ancestral gods before training, whispering ancient words in languages that their Roman masters did not understand. Others would perform small ceremonies with whatever materials they could find, arranging pebbles in patterns that reminded them of their homeland, or creating tiny shrines from scraps of cloth and broken pottery. These rituals served as anchors to their former identities, helping them maintain some sense of self in a world that constantly sought to strip away their individuality. The medical care available to gladiators was surprisingly advanced for the ancient world, but it was motivated by economic rather than humanitarian concerns. A gladiator represented a significant investment of time and money, and his death from preventable injuries was a loss that no lanista could afford to accept casually. The gladiator schools employed skilled doctors who were well-versed in treating the specific types of injuries that arena combat produced. These physicians, many of whom were themselves slaves or freedmen, developed innovative techniques for setting broken bones, suturing deep wounds, and treating infections that would not be out of place in a modern emergency room. However, the medical care came with its own form of suffering, as the gladiators were expected to return to training as quickly as possible after their injuries healed. There was no concept of adequate recovery time or rehabilitation. A gladiator who could stand was expected to fight, regardless of whether he was experiencing pain or reduced mobility. Many fought with partially healed injuries, their performance compromised by wounds that had not been given sufficient time to heal properly. This created a cycle of re-injury and chronic pain that followed many gladiators throughout their careers, however long or short those careers might be. The social dynamics within the gladiator schools were complex and often contradictory, reflecting the broader tensions of Roman society. While the gladiators were all slaves or condemned criminals, they came from vastly different backgrounds and cultures, creating a microcosm of the entire Roman Empire within the walls of each ludus. Germanic warriors who had fought against Roman legions found themselves training alongside Greek intellectuals who had been enslaved for debt, Egyptian priests who had been captured during rebellions, and Celtic druids who had been condemned for practicing forbidden religions. These men and women had to learn to work together despite language barriers, cultural differences, and the knowledge that they might eventually be forced to fight each other to the death. The gladiators developed their own informal hierarchies based on skill, experience, and the respect they commanded from their peers. Veterans who had survived multiple arena appearances were treated with deference by newer arrivals, not because of any formal rank, but because their continued existence proved their competence in the most fundamental way possible. These veteran gladiators often took younger fighters under their wing, teaching them not just combat techniques, but the subtle strategies that could mean the difference between life and death in the arena. They shared hard-won wisdom about how to read the mood of different crowds, how to appeal to the emotions of spectators, and how to make their potential deaths as meaningful as possible. The relationship between gladiators and their guards was another source of constant tension and psychological stress. The guards, usually freedmen or low-ranking Roman citizens, were responsible for maintaining order within the schools and preventing escapes. But they were also human beings who could not help but form relationships with the gladiators under their watch. Some guards were cruel and took pleasure in their power over the fighters, while others were more sympathetic and would occasionally bend rules or show small kindnesses. The gladiators had to navigate these relationships carefully, knowing that their survival might depend on staying in the good graces of men who could make their lives easier or more difficult with a word to the lanista. The food provided to gladiators was carefully calculated to serve the economic interests of the school rather than the health and happiness of the fighters. The barley-heavy diet that formed the staple of their nutrition was designed to build bulk and muscle mass quickly, giving gladiators the impressive physiques that crowds expected to see. However, this diet was monotonous and often lacking in essential nutrients, leading to health problems that could affect performance and longevity. The gladiators supplemented their official rations whenever possible, trading favors and small possessions for additional food, or catching rats and birds when they could manage it without being caught by the guards. The sleeping arrangements in the gladiator schools were designed with security rather than comfort in mind. The fighters were housed in small cells, often sharing cramped spaces with one or two other gladiators, with barely enough room to lie down. The cells were locked at night, and many gladiators were chained to iron rings set into the walls, preventing any possibility of escape or nighttime violence. The thin straw mattresses provided little cushioning against the cold stone floors, and the small, high windows provided minimal ventilation, making the cells stuffy and uncomfortable during the hot Roman summers. Privacy was non-existent, and the constant proximity to other people created additional stress for men and women who were already struggling with the psychological demands of their situation. Despite these harsh conditions, the gladiators found ways to maintain their dignity and humanity through small acts of kindness and solidarity. They would share their meager possessions without being asked, offer comfort to those who were struggling with despair, and celebrate the small victories that made their lives bearable. When one of their number was selected to fight in the arena, the others would gather around him to offer words of encouragement and practical advice, knowing that they might never see him again. These moments of connection and support created bonds that transcended the artificial divisions that Roman society tried to impose on them. The gladiators also developed their own forms of entertainment and cultural expression within the confines of their imprisonment. In the evenings, after the day's training was finished and they were locked in their cells, they would sometimes sing songs from their homelands, sharing melodies and lyrics that carried the weight of memory and loss. Those who were skilled storytellers would recount epic tales and legends, adapting them to include subtle criticisms of Roman society or expressions of hope for eventual freedom. These cultural activities served as a form of resistance against the dehumanizing effects of their captivity, reminding them that they were more than just instruments of violence and entertainment. The relationship between gladiators and the Roman public was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the broader tensions within Roman society about slavery, violence, and entertainment. While the gladiators were legally considered property and socially regarded as the lowest form of human life, there were also celebrities whose names and fighting styles were known throughout the empire. Successful gladiators could accumulate wealth and privileges that were denied to other slaves, and some even attracted the romantic attention of Roman women, including members of the aristocracy. However, this fame came at a terrible cost, as it was built entirely on their willingness to risk their lives for the amusement of people who would never consider them equals. The training schedule in the gladiator schools was relentless and unforgiving, designed to maximize the fighters' effectiveness in the arena while minimizing the time and resources required to prepare them. Each day began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, with brief breaks for meals and rest that were barely adequate to maintain the gladiators' physical health. The constant physical and psychological stress took a toll on even the strongest individuals, and many gladiators struggled with what modern observers might recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. The arena itself was a monument to Roman engineering and spectacle, but for the gladiators who would fight and die within its walls, it represented the ultimate test of everything they had learned and endured. The Colosseum, when it was finally completed, could hold over 50,000 spectators, all of whom had come to witness the carefully choreographed dance of death that would unfold on the sand-covered floor below. The arena floor was covered with fresh sand before each event, not for comfort, but to absorb the blood that would inevitably flow, and the word arena itself comes from the Latin word for sand, a linguistic reminder of the violence that defined these spaces. Beneath the arena floor lay a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical devices called the hypogeum, where gladiators waited in the darkness before their fights. These underground passages were designed to create dramatic entrances and to house the exotic animals that would also participate in the games. But they also served as a final holding area where fighters could contemplate their mortality in the damp, torch-lit gloom. The sounds of the crowd above would filter down through the floorboards, creating an almost musical backdrop of anticipation and bloodlust that followed the gladiators as they prepared for what might be their final performance the moments before. Entering the arena were filled with rituals and preparations that varied from gladiator to gladiator, but all served the same purpose of helping the fighters cope with the overwhelming fear and stress of their situation. Some would pray to their gods, whispering desperate pleas for strength, skill, or a quick death if victory was not possible. Others would perform breathing exercises or meditation techniques learned from fellow fighters, trying to achieve a state of calm acceptance that would allow them to fight effectively despite their terror. Many would simply sit in silence, running their fingers along the edges of their weapons or adjusting their armor one final time, finding comfort in the familiar weight and feel of their equipment. The gladiators entered the arena through gates that were designed to create maximum dramatic impact, emerging from the darkness of the hypogeum into the blazing sunlight and thunderous noise of the crowd. The transition was deliberately jarring, intended to disorient and overwhelm the fighters while thrilling the spectators who had paid to witness their struggle. The gladiators would march in formation around the perimeter of the arena, their weapons and armor gleaming in the sun, their faces hidden behind masks or helmets that transformed them into symbols rather than individuals. This parade, called the Pampa, was as much a part of the entertainment as the fighting itself, allowing the crowd to study the combatants and place their bets on the outcomes. The famous Salute Avenue, Caesar, morituri te salutant, Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you, was not actually spoken by gladiators as regularly as popular culture suggests, but when it was used, it carried a weight of irony and resignation that modern audiences can barely comprehend. The gladiators were acknowledging not just the emperor but the entire system that had reduced them to this moment, recognizing the power structure that had brought them to the edge of death for the entertainment of others. The salute was both an act of submission and a subtle form of rebellion, a way of saying that they understood exactly what was happening to them, and why the fights themselves were not the chaotic free-for-alls that modern movies often portray, but carefully orchestrated events that followed established rules and conventions. Different types of gladiators were matched against each other in specific combinations that had been proven to create exciting contests, with the heavily armored Murmillo typically fighting against the lightly equipped Retiarius, or the agile Threx facing the defensive Secutor. These matchups were designed to create dramatic contrasts in fighting styles and equipment, ensuring that each combat would have its own unique rhythm and character while maximizing the entertainment value for the audience. The gladiators fought with real weapons that were sharp enough to cause serious injury and death, but the contests were not necessarily fights to the death. Many gladiators survived multiple arena appearances, accumulating scars and experience that made them even more valuable as entertainers. The decision of whether a defeated gladiator would live or die was not made by the victor, but by the sponsor of the games, who would consider the crowd's reaction, the quality of the fight, and the financial investment represented by the losing gladiator. A fighter who had performed well and entertained the crowd might be spared even in defeat, while one who had disappointed the audience might be condemned to death, regardless of his fighting ability. The medical care available to gladiators who survived their arena appearances was surprisingly sophisticated, reflecting the significant economic investment that each fighter represented. The gladiator schools employed skilled surgeons who were experienced in treating the specific types of injuries that arena combat produced, and these physicians developed innovative techniques for emergency surgery that would not be out of place in a modern trauma center. However, the medical care was motivated by economics rather than compassion, and gladiators who were too severely injured to continue fighting were often simply abandoned to die, their usefulness at an end. The psychological toll of arena combat extended far beyond the physical injuries that gladiators sustained. Many fighters struggled with what modern observers would recognize as survivor's guilt, particularly after defeating and killing opponents who had been their friends and training partners. The gladiators were forced to compartmentalize their emotions in ways that took a tremendous psychological toll, separating their humanity from their function as entertainers in order to survive. Some developed elaborate coping mechanisms, creating mental barriers between their arena persona and their private self, while others seemed to lose themselves entirely in the violence, becoming hollow shells of their former selves. The crowd's reaction to gladiatorial combat was as complex and varied as Roman society itself, reflecting the deep contradictions and tensions within the empire. While many spectators genuinely enjoyed the violence and spectacle, others attended the games primarily for social reasons, using the events as opportunities to see and be seen by their peers. The arena was a place where social hierarchies were both reinforced and challenged, where slaves could become heroes, and where emperors could demonstrate their power and generosity. The gladiators themselves were aware of these dynamics and learned to play to different segments of the crowd, understanding that their survival might depend on their ability to read and respond to the complex social currents that flowed through the stands. The training regimen for gladiators was designed not just to prepare them for combat, but to break down their previous identities and rebuild them as entertainment products. The process was deliberately dehumanizing, intended to strip away the fighters' individual personalities and replace them with standardized roles that would be easily recognizable to audiences. The gladiators learned to suppress their natural reactions and emotions, to perform aggression and fearlessness even when they were terrified, and to treat their own bodies as instruments of spectacle rather than as the sacred vessels of their souls. The social hierarchy within the gladiator schools was complex and often brutal, reflecting the broader power dynamics of Roman society while creating its own unique forms of oppression and resistance. New arrivals were subjected to hazing and intimidation by established fighters who used their knowledge and experience as tools of control over the newcomers. However, this same system also provided a form of mentorship and protection for those who proved themselves worthy, creating bonds of loyalty and mutual support that transcended the artificial divisions imposed by their captors. The gladiators developed their own secret language and communication systems, using gestures, glances, and coded phrases to share information and coordinate resistance activities without alerting their guards. These communication networks allowed them to organize small acts of rebellion, share resources, and provide emotional support to fighters who were struggling with despair. The language they developed was necessarily subtle and indirect as discovery. could result in severe punishment or death, but it served as a vital lifeline for men and women who were otherwise completely isolated from the outside world. The economic system that supported gladiatorial combat was vast and complex, involving not just the gladiator schools and arena operators, but also weapons manufacturers, animal suppliers, medical personnel, and countless other service providers. The gladiators themselves were valuable commodities whose worth was calculated based on their fighting ability, their entertainment value, and their potential for generating profit through betting and sponsorship opportunities. This commodification of human life created a system of incentives that encouraged the continued operation of the gladiatorial system, even when individual Romans might have had moral qualms about its brutality. The religious and spiritual dimensions of gladiatorial combat were as important as its economic and social aspects, reflecting the deep-seated Roman beliefs about honor, death, and the afterlife. Many gladiators developed their own spiritual practices and beliefs, combining elements from their ancestral religions with Roman customs and the unique challenges of their situation. Some came to see their arena appearances as religious rituals, opportunities to demonstrate their devotion to their gods or to achieve a form of spiritual purification through suffering. Others rejected religion entirely, finding it impossible to reconcile their circumstances with any benevolent divine plan. The gladiators' relationships with their weapons and equipment were deeply personal and often spiritual in nature. Each piece of armor and every weapon was carefully maintained and customized to fit the individual fighter's preferences and fighting style. The gladiators would spend hours cleaning and sharpening their weapons, not just for practical reasons, but as a form of meditation and preparation for combat. Many developed superstitions and rituals around their equipment, believing that certain weapons or pieces of armor held special properties or brought them luck in the arena. The living conditions in the gladiator schools were designed to maximize security and minimize cost, with little regard for the comfort or dignity of the fighters. The cells were small and cramped, with minimal furniture and no privacy, forcing the gladiators to live in close quarters with men and women who might be their opponents in future arena appearances. The constant proximity to other people created additional stress and tension, as the fighters had to navigate complex social dynamics, while also preparing for the possibility that they might have to kill or be killed by their cellmates. The gladiators' diet was carefully controlled and monitored, designed to build muscle mass and maintain fighting condition while minimizing costs and preventing the accumulation of resources that might be used for escape attempts. The fighters were fed primarily barley and beans, supplemented with small amounts of meat and vegetables when available. This diet was monotonous and often inadequate, leading to nutritional deficiencies that could affect both physical and mental health. The gladiators supplemented their official rations whenever possible, trading favors and small possessions for additional food or catching small animals when they could manage it without being detected by the guards. The training schedule in the gladiator schools was relentless and unforgiving, designed to maximize the fighters' effectiveness in the arena while minimizing the time and resources required to prepare them. Each day began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, with brief breaks for meals and rest that were barely adequate to maintain the gladiators' physical health. The constant physical and psychological stress took a tremendous toll on even the strongest individuals, and many gladiators struggled with chronic pain, exhaustion, and emotional instability that made their already difficult lives even more challenging. The families of gladiators faced their own unique form of suffering, as they were often separated from their loved ones with little hope of reunion or even communication. Many gladiators were fathers and husbands who had been torn away from their families through capture and war, enslavement for debt, or criminal conviction, leaving behind wives and children who might never know what had become of them. The families of gladiators lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, whether they had found some measure of peace in their captivity, or whether they had died violently in the arena. For the entertainment of strangers, the children of gladiators faced particular challenges, as they were often born into slavery themselves, or left to survive on their own in a society that offered few opportunities for the poor and powerless. Some children followed their fathers into the gladiator schools, perpetuating the cycle of violence and exploitation that had claimed their parents. Others were sold into different forms of slavery, scattered across the empire to work in mines, households, or farms, their connection to their gladiator heritage becoming a source of shame rather than pride. The few who managed to remain free often lived in poverty, struggling to survive without the support of their fathers and bearing the social stigma associated with their family's circumstances. The wives of gladiators faced their own unique challenges, as they were often left to care for children and manage households without any support from their husbands. Some were enslaved alongside their husbands, forced to work in Roman households or sold to brothels, while others were left to struggle as free women in a society that offered few opportunities for female independence. The wives of gladiators lived with the constant knowledge that their husbands might die at any moment, that they might never see them again, and that their own survival depended on their ability to navigate a hostile world without protection or support. The gladiator schools themselves were businesses that operated according to the brutal logic of profit and loss, with the lives of the fighters being secondary to the financial interests of their owners. The Lannistae who owned these schools were often former gladiators themselves, who had earned their freedom and accumulated enough wealth to purchase their own fighters, creating a system where the oppressed became the oppressors in an endless cycle of exploitation. These businessmen had to balance the need to keep their gladiators alive and healthy against the costs of feeding, housing, and training them, leading to conditions that were barely adequate to maintain life and fighting ability. The gladiators' relationships with their owners were complex and often contradictory, reflecting the broader tensions within Roman society about slavery, violence, and human dignity. Some Lannistae were genuinely concerned about the welfare of their fighters, understanding that well-treated gladiators were more likely to perform well and generate profits over the long term. Others were brutal and exploitative, viewing their gladiators as nothing more than expensive livestock whose only value lay in their ability to entertain crowds. The gladiators themselves had to navigate these relationships carefully, understanding that their survival might depend on staying in their owner's good graces while also maintaining their own dignity and humanity. The training of gladiators was not limited to physical combat skills, but included instruction in showmanship, crowd psychology, and the theatrical aspects of arena performance. The gladiators learned to read the mood of different crowds, to understand when spectators wanted to see mercy and when they hungered for blood, and to adapt their fighting styles and behaviors accordingly. They practiced falling dramatically, when wounded, making their injuries appear more severe than they actually were to increase the chances that the crowd would call for their lives to be spared. They learned to make their victories appear hard-won and their defeats appear noble, understanding that their survival often depended on their ability to entertain as much as their ability to fight. The gladiators also had to master the art of dying well, as a good death could bring honor to their memory and sometimes financial support for their families. The Roman concept of a good death emphasized courage, dignity, and acceptance of fate, and gladiators who died bravely in the arena were sometimes celebrated as heroes despite their low social status. The gladiators practiced dying positions and final gestures, learning to make their deaths as meaningful and dramatic as possible for the entertainment of the crowd. This macabre form of theatrical training was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of gladiator preparation, as it required the fighters to contemplate and rehearse their own deaths on a regular basis. The seasonal nature of gladiatorial games meant that the fighters experienced periods of intense activity, followed by long stretches of waiting and uncertainty. The major games were typically held during religious festivals or to commemorate important events, creating a calendar of potential death dates that the gladiators had to live with throughout the year. During the off-season, the gladiators continued their training and maintenance routines, but they also had more time to think about their situation, to grieve for fallen comrades, and to contemplate the likelihood of their own survival. These periods of relative calm were often more psychologically difficult than the busy times leading up to games, as they allowed the full weight of the gladiators' circumstances to settle upon them. The gladiators developed elaborate superstitions and rituals around their arena appearances, creating personal mythologies that helped them cope with the randomness and brutality of their situation. Some believed that certain gods or spirits protected them in combat, while others developed complex systems of omens and portents that they used to predict the outcomes of their fights. These beliefs served as psychological anchors that helped the gladiators maintain some sense of control and meaning in circumstances that were otherwise completely beyond their influence. The rituals and superstitions also created a sense of community among the fighters, as they shared and adapted each other's beliefs and practices. The medical knowledge that developed around gladiatorial combat was surprisingly advanced for the ancient world, as the need to keep valuable fighters alive and healthy drove innovations in surgical technique and trauma care. The gladiator schools employed skilled physicians who specialized in treating the specific types of injuries that arena combat produced, and these doctors developed techniques for emergency surgery, wound care, and rehabilitation that would not be out of place in a modern medical setting. However, this medical care was motivated by economic considerations rather than humanitarian concerns, and gladiators who were too severely injured to continue fighting were often abandoned to die. The gladiators' relationships with pain and injury were complex and often contradictory, as they had to learn to function effectively despite chronic discomfort and the constant threat of serious harm. Many gladiators developed a high tolerance for pain through their training and combat experiences, learning to ignore injuries that would incapacitate ordinary people. However, this adaptation came at a tremendous psychological cost, as the gladiators had to suppress their natural responses to pain and injury in order to continue functioning. The constant exposure to violence and trauma also created emotional numbing that made it difficult for the gladiators to form normal human relationships or experience the full range of human emotions. The gladiators' understanding of time and mortality was shaped by the constant proximity of death and the uncertain nature of their future. Many gladiators lived entirely in the present, unable to plan for a future that might not exist and unwilling to dwell on a past that was lost forever. This temporal compression created a unique form of psychological adaptation that allowed the gladiators to function despite their circumstances, but it also made it difficult for them to maintain hope or work toward long-term goals. The gladiators learned to find meaning and satisfaction in small, immediate pleasures and achievements, understanding that these might be all they would ever have. The social dynamics within the gladiator schools were influenced by the diverse backgrounds and cultures of the fighters, creating a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and mutual dependencies. Gladiators from similar backgrounds often formed ethnic or cultural groups that provided mutual support and maintained connections to their ancestral traditions. However, these divisions could also create conflicts and tensions that made life in the schools even more difficult. The gladiators had to learn to navigate these social complexities while also preparing for the possibility that they might have to fight against members of their own cultural groups in the arena. Got the gladiators access to information about the outside world was severely limited, as their owners and guards sought to prevent them from learning about escape routes, potential allies, or political developments that might affect their situation. This information isolation was another form of psychological control that made the gladiators more dependent on their captors and less likely to attempt rebellion or escape. The gladiators relied on rumors, gossip, and fragments of overheard conversations to piece together a picture of the world beyond their walls. But this information was often incomplete, outdated, or deliberately misleading. The gladiators' dreams and aspirations were shaped by the harsh realities of their situation, but they still maintained hopes and goals that helped them survive the daily grind of training and preparation. Some dreamed of earning their freedom through exceptional performance in the arena, while others hoped simply to survive long enough to see their families again. Many gladiators focused on smaller, more achievable goals, such as mastering a particular fighting technique, earning the respect of their peers, or simply making it through another day without serious injury. These dreams and aspirations, however modest, provided the psychological fuel that enabled the gladiators to continue fighting despite the overwhelming odds against them. The gladiators' relationships with their guards and trainers were marked by a complex mixture of dependence, resentment, and mutual understanding. The guards and trainers were often former gladiators themselves who had earned their freedom through exceptional service, creating a situation where the oppressed became the oppressors in an endless cycle of exploitation. However, these relationships also provided opportunities for mentorship and support, as the guards and trainers understood better than anyone the challenges and dangers that the gladiators faced. The gladiators had to learn to navigate these relationships carefully, understanding that their survival might depend on staying in their supervisor's good graces while also maintaining their own dignity and humanity. The gladiators' exposure to different cultures and languages through their fellow fighters provided one of the few positive aspects of their captivity, as they were able to learn about different ways of life and different perspectives on the world. Many gladiators became multilingual out of necessity, learning to communicate with fighters from across the Roman Empire and beyond. This cultural exchange created a unique form of education that was not available to most people in the ancient world, as the gladiators were exposed to ideas, customs, and beliefs from dozens of different societies. However, this cultural richness was overshadowed by the brutal circumstances that had brought these diverse groups together. The gladiators' understanding of honor and dignity was shaped by their circumstances, but also by their cultural backgrounds and personal values. Many gladiators maintained strict codes of personal conduct that helped them preserve their sense of self-worth despite their degraded social status. These codes often emphasized courage, loyalty, and mutual support, creating a form of alternative morality that existed parallel to and sometimes in conflict with Roman social values. The gladiators' commitment to these personal codes of honor often provided the strength and motivation they needed to continue fighting despite the overwhelming odds against them. The psychological transformation that occurred in gladiators over time was perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of their experience, as many fighters gradually lost touch with their original identities and became defined entirely by their role as entertainers. The process was gradual and often imperceptible, beginning with small adaptations to their circumstances and evolving into fundamental changes in personality and worldview. New gladiators would arrive at the schools with memories of their former lives still fresh and vivid, but over months and years of training and combat, these memories would fade and become overshadowed by the immediate demands of survival and performance. The constant stress and trauma of gladiatorial life created psychological adaptations that were necessary for survival, but came at a tremendous cost to the fighters' mental health and emotional well-being. Many gladiators developed what modern psychologists would recognize as dissociative disorders, creating mental barriers between their arena persona and their private self in order to cope with the violence and degradation they experienced. Some fighters seemed to lose the ability to form normal human relationships, becoming isolated and withdrawn even from their fellow gladiators. Others developed aggressive or unpredictable behaviors that made them dangerous to be around, even when they were not fighting in the arena. The gladiators' relationship with their own bodies was fundamentally altered by their experience, as they learned to view their physical selves as instruments of entertainment rather than as the sacred vessels of their souls. The constant training and preparation for combat created a hyper-awareness of physical condition and capability, but it also led to a form of objectification that was both self-imposed and externally reinforced. The gladiators learned to evaluate their own worth based on their fighting ability and physical appearance, internalizing the same standards that their owners and audiences used to judge them. The seasonal rhythms of gladiatorial games created a unique form of temporal anxiety that affected every aspect of the fighters' lives. During the months leading up to major festivals and celebrations, the gladiators would experience increasing levels of stress and anticipation, knowing that they might be selected to fight and possibly die for the entertainment of the crowds. The selection process itself was often arbitrary and unpredictable, based on factors such as crowd appeal, fighting style matchups, and the personal preferences of the game sponsors rather than on any objective measure of skill or readiness. Gladiators who managed to survive multiple arena appearances often developed a form of combat wisdom that went far beyond mere technical skill, encompassing an understanding of crowd psychology, political dynamics, and the complex social forces that determined their fate. These veteran fighters learned to read the subtle signs and signals that indicated whether a particular fight was intended to be a serious contest or merely a spectacle, whether the crowd was in a merciful mood or hungry for blood, and whether the political climate favored displays of mercy or demonstrations of Roman power. This knowledge was invaluable for survival, but it also required a level of cynicism and emotional detachment that was psychologically damaging. The gladiators' exposure to different forms of combat and weaponry from across the Roman Empire created a unique form of military education that was both broader and more specialized than what most soldiers received. The fighters learned not just to use their own weapons effectively, but to understand and counter the techniques used by gladiators from different traditions and backgrounds. This combat knowledge was highly valued and was sometimes used to train Roman soldiers or to develop new military tactics, but it was also a form of cultural appropriation that stripped the gladiators' ancestral fighting traditions of their original meaning and context. The religious and spiritual lives of gladiators were profoundly affected by their circumstances, as they struggled to reconcile their situation with their beliefs about divine justice, fate, and the afterlife. Many gladiators experienced a crisis of faith, finding it difficult to believe in benevolent gods who would allow such suffering and injustice to continue. Others developed syncretic religious practices that combined elements from different traditions, creating personal belief systems that helped them find meaning and hope in their circumstances. Some gladiators turned to philosophy, particularly Stoicism, which emphasized acceptance of fate and the cultivation of inner strength and dignity. The gladiators' dreams and sleep patterns were often disturbed by the trauma and stress of their daily lives, leading to chronic sleep deprivation and psychological exhaustion. Many fighters suffered from nightmares about past battles, recurring dreams about their families and former lives, or anxiety dreams about upcoming fights. The sleeping arrangements in the gladiator schools were not conducive to restful sleep, as the fighters were often chained at night and housed in cramped, uncomfortable conditions with little privacy or quiet. The lack of adequate sleep affected their physical performance, mental acuity, and emotional stability, creating a cycle of deterioration that was difficult to break. The gladiators' relationships with food and eating were complicated by the controlled nature of their diet and the constant awareness that each meal might be their last. Many fighters developed eating disorders or obsessive behaviors around food, hoarding scraps when possible or becoming fixated on particular foods that reminded them of their former lives. The barley-heavy diet that was standard in gladiator schools was intended to build muscle mass and physical strength, but it was also monotonous and often nutritionally inadequate, leading to cravings and deficiencies that affected both physical and mental health. The gladiators' understanding of time and mortality was profoundly shaped by the constant proximity of death and the uncertain nature of their future. Many fighters lived entirely in the present, unable to plan for a future that might not exist, and unwilling to dwell on a past that was lost forever. This temporal compression created a unique form of psychological adaptation that allowed the gladiators to function despite their circumstances, but it also made it difficult for them to maintain hope or work toward long-term goals. The gladiators learned to find meaning and satisfaction in small, immediate pleasures and achievements, understanding that these might be all they would ever have. The gladiators' social relationships were complicated by the knowledge that they might be forced to fight against each other at any time, creating a form of intimacy that was both deeper and more fragile than normal human relationships. The fighters formed bonds of friendship and mutual support that were intensified by their shared suffering and common fate, but these relationships were always overshadowed by the possibility of betrayal or violence. Some gladiators chose to remain emotionally distant from their fellow fighters as a form of self-protection, while others threw themselves into relationships with desperate intensity, seeking to experience as much human connection as possible. Before it was too late, the gladiators' exposure to the political and social dynamics of Roman society through their participation in the games provided them with a unique perspective on the empire's power structures and cultural values. The fighters learned to understand the complex relationships between different social classes, the role of violence in maintaining political order, and the ways in which entertainment was used to distract and pacify the population. This knowledge was both empowering and disheartening, as it revealed the systematic nature of their oppression, while also showing them how deeply embedded the gladiatorial system was in Roman society. The gladiators' physical appearance was carefully managed and controlled to maximize their entertainment value, with different types of fighters being expected to conform to specific aesthetic standards. The heavily muscled physiques that were typical of gladiators were not just the result of training, but were also cultivated through careful diet and exercise regimens, designed to create the kind of spectacular bodies that audiences expected to see. The gladiators' scars and injuries were often seen as marks of honor and experience, but they were also reminders of the violence and suffering that defined their lives. The gladiators' access to luxury goods and privileges was strictly controlled and used as a form of psychological manipulation to encourage good behavior and outstanding performance. Successful fighters might be rewarded with better food, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, or small personal possessions that provided comfort and a sense of individual identity. However, these privileges could be withdrawn at any time, creating a system of rewards and punishments that kept the gladiators in a constant state of psychological dependence on their captors. The gladiators' relationships with their weapons and equipment were deeply personal and often spiritual in nature. as these tools were literally the instruments of their survival and identity. Each gladiator would spend hours maintaining and customizing their gear, developing preferences and superstitions around particular pieces of equipment. The weapons and armor became extensions of the fighters' bodies and personalities, and the loss or damage of a favored piece of equipment could be psychologically devastating. The gladiators often developed elaborate rituals around the care and preparation of their gear, finding in these activities a form of meditation and spiritual practice that helped them cope with the stress and uncertainty of their situation. The gladiators' understanding of honor and shame was shaped by their circumstances, but also influenced by their cultural backgrounds and personal values. Many fighters maintained strict codes of personal conduct that helped them preserve their sense of self-worth despite their degraded social status. These codes often emphasized courage, loyalty, and mutual support, creating a form of alternative morality that existed parallel to, and sometimes in conflict with, Roman social values. The gladiators' commitment to these personal codes of honor often provided the strength and motivation they needed to continue fighting despite the overwhelming odds against them. The gladiators' exposure to different languages and cultures through their fellow fighters provided one of the few positive aspects of their captivity, as they were able to learn about different ways of life and different perspectives on the world. Many gladiators became multilingual out of necessity, learning to communicate with fighters from across the Roman Empire and beyond. This cultural exchange created a unique form of education that was not available to most people in the ancient world, as the gladiators were exposed ideas, customs, and beliefs from dozens of different societies. However, this cultural richness was overshadowed by the brutal circumstances that had brought these diverse groups together. The gladiators' dreams of freedom and escape were both a source of hope and a form of psychological torture, as the possibility of liberation remained tantalizingly out of reach for most fighters. Some gladiators fantasized about earning their freedom through exceptional performance in the arena, while others dreamed of escape or rescue by friends and family members. These dreams provided motivation and hope during the darkest moments of their captivity, but they also created a form of psychological torment when reality failed to match their aspirations. The gladiators learned to balance hope with acceptance, maintaining their dreams while also preparing themselves for the likelihood that they would die in captivity. The gladiators' legacy extended far beyond their individual lives and deaths, as their stories became part of the cultural mythology of Rome and the broader ancient world. The most successful and charismatic gladiators became legendary figures whose names and exploits were celebrated in poetry, art, and popular culture. However, this fame came at a tremendous cost, as it was built entirely on their suffering and sacrifice. The gladiators' stories served as both entertainment and cautionary tales, reminding audiences of the price of rebellion and the consequences of falling from grace in Roman society. The final years of a gladiator's life were often marked by a profound sense of acceptance and resignation, as the fighters came to understand that their fate was largely beyond their control and that their survival depended on their ability to adapt to circumstances rather than to change them. The veteran gladiators who had survived multiple arena appearances developed a unique perspective on life and death that was both tragic and inspiring, combining deep wisdom about human nature with an acceptance of mortality that few people in any era have achieved. These seasoned fighters often became mentors and guides for younger gladiators, sharing not just combat techniques but life lessons about dignity, courage, and the importance of maintaining one's humanity, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Gladiators' understanding of love and human connection was profoundly shaped by their circumstances, as they learned to form deep bonds with fellow fighters, while also preparing for the possibility of loss and separation. The love between gladiators was often more intense and immediate than relationships in the outside world, as the fighters knew that their time together was limited and uncertain. These relationships took many forms, from the brotherly bonds between training partners to romantic attachments that developed despite the constant threat of death. The gladiators learned to love fully and completely, while also holding something back, protecting themselves from the devastating grief that would follow the inevitable loss of their loved ones. The gladiators' relationship with their audience was complex and often contradictory, as they depended on the crowd's approval for their survival, while also resenting the people who had come to watch them suffer and die. The fighters learned to read the subtle signs and signals that indicated the crowd's mood and preferences, understanding that their ability to entertain was just as important as their ability to fight. Some gladiators developed a genuine affection for their audiences, finding in the crowd's cheers and applause a form of validation and recognition that helped them maintain their sense of self-worth. Others remained cynical and detached, viewing the spectators as part of the system that had enslaved and degraded them. The gladiators' final moments in the arena were often marked by a strange sense of peace and clarity, as the fighters who had spent years preparing for death finally faced their ultimate test. Many gladiators reported feeling a sense of relief when they realized that their ordeal was finally coming to an end, that they would no longer have to endure the constant stress and uncertainty of their captivity. The dying gladiators often used their final moments to send messages to their families, to make peace with their gods, or to demonstrate their courage and dignity one last time. These final acts of defiance and humanity were often the most powerful and memorable parts of their lives, creating legacies that outlasted their physical existence. The gladiators who managed to earn their freedom through exceptional performance, or the generosity of their owners, faced unique challenges in adapting to life outside the arena. Many freed gladiators struggled with what modern psychologists would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, finding it difficult to adjust to normal social relationships and civilian life after years of violence and captivity. Some former gladiators became trainers or guards in gladiator schools, using their experience and knowledge to help prepare the next generation of fighters. Others tried to disappear into the general population, seeking to forget their past and build new lives away from the arena and its memories. The impact of gladiatorial combat on Roman society extended far beyond the arena itself, as the games both reflected and reinforced the empire's values and power structures. The gladiators served as symbols of Roman dominance and cultural superiority, demonstrating the empire's ability to turn its enemies into entertainers and its prisoners into spectacles. The games also provided a form of social release valve, allowing the Roman population to experience vicarious violence and excitement while remaining safely distant from actual danger. The gladiators' suffering and sacrifice became a form of collective entertainment that helped bind Roman society together through shared experiences of spectacle and bloodshed. The gladiators' stories have echoed through history as powerful reminders of human resilience and the capacity for dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. Their experiences speak to universal themes of survival, identity, and the struggle to maintain one's humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. The gladiators' legacy has inspired countless works of art, literature, and popular culture, but it has also served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating human beings as commodities and entertainment. Their stories remind us that behind every historical statistic and cultural phenomenon are individual human beings with their own hopes, fears, dreams, and sufferings. The gladiators' influence on military tactics and combat techniques extended far beyond the arena, as their specialized knowledge of weapons and fighting styles was often incorporated into Roman military training and strategy. The gladiators' understanding of psychology and crowd dynamics also influenced Roman approaches to public spectacle and political theater, as the empire's leaders learned to use entertainment and violence as tools of social control. The gladiatorial system became a model for other forms of organized violence and spectacle throughout the ancient world, spreading Roman cultural values and practices far beyond the borders of the empire itself. The gladiators' relationship with pain and suffering was fundamentally different from that of most people, as they had learned to accept and even embrace physical discomfort as an inevitable part of their existence. This acceptance was both a form of spiritual discipline and a practical survival strategy, as gladiators who could not tolerate pain were unlikely to survive their training and combat experiences. The fighters developed elaborate mental techniques for managing pain and fear, using meditation, visualization, and other psychological tools to maintain their focus and effectiveness even under extreme stress. The gladiators' understanding of time and mortality gave them a unique perspective on the meaning and value of life, as they learned to find significance and beauty in moments that most people would consider insignificant. A shared meal, a conversation with a fellow fighter, a moment of quiet reflection, these small experiences took on profound meaning for people who knew that each day might be their last. The gladiators' ability to find joy and meaning in the midst of suffering speaks to the fundamental resilience of the human spirit and the capacity for hope even in the darkest circumstances. The gladiators' physical and psychological scars served as permanent reminders of their experiences, marking them as different from the general population even after they had earned their freedom. These scars were both badges of honor and sources of shame, representing the gladiators' survival and skill, while also marking them as members of a degraded class. The scars became part of the gladiators' identity, connecting them to their past while also limiting their possibilities for the future. Many freed gladiators struggled with their scarred bodies and damaged psyches, finding it difficult to form normal relationships or to see themselves as anything other than former entertainment objects. The gladiators' dreams and aspirations evolved. Over time, as the fighters learned to adjust their expectations and hopes to match the realities of their situation, new gladiators often arrived with grandiose dreams of earning their freedom and returning to their former lives. But veteran fighters learned to find satisfaction in smaller, more achievable goals. The ability to adapt one's dreams and expectations to changing circumstances was a crucial survival skill that helped the gladiators maintain their psychological health and motivation even in the face of overwhelming odds. The gladiators' legacy in popular culture and historical memory has been shaped by both admiration for their courage and skill and fascination with their exotic and violent lifestyle. The romanticization of gladiatorial combat in modern entertainment often obscures the brutal realities of their existence, focusing on the spectacle and excitement of arena combat while ignoring the systematic oppression and dehumanization that made the games possible. The gladiators' true legacy lies not in their fighting prowess or entertainment value, but in their demonstration of human dignity and resilience in the face of extreme adversity. The gladiators' influence on the development of Roman law and social policy was limited but significant, as their experiences highlighted some of the contradictions and injustices inherent in the imperial system. The legal status of gladiators was complex and often contradictory, as they were simultaneously property and performers, slaves and celebrities, criminals and heroes. Their unique position in Roman society forced legal scholars and administrators to grapple with questions about human rights, personal autonomy, and the limits of state power that would not be fully resolved for centuries. The gladiators' spiritual and philosophical contributions to ancient thought were often overlooked by contemporary observers, but have been recognized by modern scholars as significant and valuable. The gladiators' experiences of suffering, mortality, and powerlessness gave them insights into the human condition that were not available to most people in the ancient world. Their philosophical reflections on fate, courage, and dignity influenced the development of Stoic philosophy and other ancient schools of thought, contributing to humanity's ongoing dialogue about the meaning and purpose of existence. As our journey through the world of ancient Rome draws to a close, let yourself settle even deeper into the comfort of your bed, feeling the weight of these ancient stories like a gentle blanket wrapped around your soul. The gladiators' struggles and sufferings are now part of the distant past, their voices echoing across the centuries to remind us of the preciousness of our own freedom and the importance of treating all human beings with dignity and respect. Their legacy lives on not in the violence and spectacle of the arena, but in their quiet demonstrations of courage, loyalty, and love in the face of impossible circumstances. Let the images of ancient Rome fade gently from your mind now, like morning mist dissolving in the warm sunlight as you drift deeper into peaceful sleep. Feel your breathing slow and deepen, your body relaxing completely as you release the tensions and worries of your own day. The gladiators' stories have been told, their struggles acknowledged, their humanity honored. Now it is time for you to rest, to dream your own dreams, to find peace in the knowledge that you are safe and free, surrounded by comfort and love. Sleep well, knowing that the courage and dignity of those ancient fighters lives on in the compassion and understanding that you carry in your heart.